Some winters stay in the weather, and some settle somewhere deeper, like the ones carved into the bones of early settlers trying to tame the American frontier with little more than woolen socks and an unreasonable amount of optimism. If you've ever watched snow fall and thought it looked peaceful, you've clearly never been on the wrong side of a log cabin door, with 3 months of pickled cabbage to eat and a visiting bear doing laps around your outhouse. For these settlers, winter wasn't a season. It was a strategy game played against an unstoppable white opponent named General January, and he did not play fair. Life in the 1800s countryside was, on a good day, what we now call rustic and Airbnb hosts call charmingly off-grid. But once winter arrived, charm took a leave of absence. Farms became islands. Roads vanished under snowdrifts. Mail delivery, frozen in time. Literally. If you were lucky enough to get a letter in February, it had probably been written in October and involved someone asking if you'd please return the butter churn. Too late, Martha. The butter has frozen into an emotional state and legally changed its name to Ice Cube. Cut off from the world, settlers settled, not just into blankets and hearthside seats, but into a curious form of hibernation. Days slowed, blurred. The lines between Tuesday and Thursday disappeared, much like the family cow in snowstorm-related incidents we no longer speak of. Daily routines moved indoors. Anything that didn't involve feeding animals or not dying politely waited until April. Bread was baked again. Socks were mended again. That one book, the family's only book, was read aloud multiple times. Variations included the thrilling adventures of Now It's Father's Turn to Read It, and Why is page 74 still missing? Children, brimming with a level of energy suspiciously undimmed by salted pork and dull porridge, invented indoor amusements of questionable safety. One popular game was Let's Pretend the Bed is a Boat. Another was Let's Put the Cat in the Butter Churn. And who could forget the timeless classic, Is This Candle Edible? Entertainment for adults was slightly more refined, taking the form of needlework, storytelling, and contemplating the absurd idea of owning a piano. That is, until the woodpile started looking a little low and the furniture began nervously eyeing the fireplace. Isolation lent itself to strange pursuits. Some men, left alone with too many beats and too many thoughts, began carving spoons with elaborate handles, not out of art, but possibly as a form of passive aggression. There are recorded cases of travelers arriving in March to find entire families with spoons longer than their arms. No one asked why. One simply nodded and accepted stew with gratitude and a 3-foot utensil. Meanwhile, the shared hardship encouraged quiet creativity. Quilts weren't just warmth, they were canvases of hidden codes, family symbols, and what historians now believe to be early depictions of someone inventing the concept of indoor plumbing through sheer will. And it wasn't all gloom and cabbage. In fact, winter was the great equalizer. Everyone smelled faintly of onions. Everyone's boots squeaked with betrayal when they stepped onto the cold floor in the morning. And nearly every household developed a shared vocabulary of grunts, sighs, and the quiet language of tea. 1 cup means I'm fine. 2 cups means I've seen a raccoon in the pantry again. And 3 cups means I'm going feral and knitting socks from spite. The passing of time was measured less by clocks and more by stew thickness. In January, the stew was watery, hopeful. By March, it could hold a spoon upright out of sheer exhaustion. Outside, the snow blanketed everything in silence. Not just a quiet, but the kind that settles into your clothes, your beard, and your understanding of dignity when you realize you've just spent 20 minutes chasing a frozen chicken with a broom. Yet, under all this, under the hardship and absurdity and the 15 varieties of porridge, there was something unshakable. A rhythm, a knowing. Generations carved out warmth from the world's cold shoulder, spinning humour and hope into the long months when everything else felt paused. And when March finally tapped politely on the frosted windows, promising mud and sun, and maybe just the ghost of a songbird, they were still there. Sleepier, certainly, a little thinner, and maybe slightly disturbed by how good they'd gotten at spoon whittling. But still there. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes, if they've not already wandered shut, and let the snow keep falling, soft and steady. Because next, we tiptoe into how people kept warm, without central heating or, tragically, flannel pajamas. If you'd like to know just how long a New England winter could feel, try building a cabin out of green wood while pretending it's not freezing, and historically undercooked stew isn't your only dinner option. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, settlers across North America were not just battling the cold. They were introducing themselves, often poorly, to an environment that didn't much care for their enthusiasm. Most had come from milder climates, or at least from towns with, walls. So when winter descended like a sleepy bear onto their newly cleared land, these folks had only the faint whisper of preparation, and perhaps a single pair of wool socks to be shared among a family of 6. Let us take a short journey to the edges of settlement in, say, upstate New York in 1803. The kind of place where a neighbor meant someone a 2-day sled ride away. The roads, to the extent they could be called that, vanished each November under feet of snow, replaced by an etiquette of isolation. Social calls became messages carved into trees. Mail. Hope you like reading the last letter from August until April thaws it out of your distant cousin's frozen saddlebag. And yet, they stayed. Built houses, kept cows from freezing into beef cycles, and somehow spun these snow-encased winters into a rhythm of life. It was quiet, sure, but not boring. If you were trapped in a log home with 4 kids, a mother-in-law, and a goat named Spindle who had opinions, you often prayed for a bit of boring. When December came and travel became impossible, so did the delivery of almost everything. Salt ran out last Tuesday. Flour, gone, unless you counted the little bit stuck to the bottom of the barrel. This was a time before grocery stores, remember. Running out for a loaf of bread meant literally running out to the nearest tree that might still be storing some squirrels. Baking became an aspirational activity, often involving crushed acorns and a laughably optimistic attempt at yeast. But here's the thing. They weren't quite as doomed as it all sounds. Settlers knew winter was coming the way we now know our phone battery will drop to 15% just before a long train ride. So they prepared. Somewhat. Root cellars were dug deep into the earth, filled with hopeful cabbages and resentful potatoes who knew exactly what fate awaited them. Apples were carefully dried and hung in sacks that could outlast at least one good blizzard. Pork was salted so heavily it could legally classify as a salt lick. And preserves, lovingly boiled and sealed, stood in glass jars like fruity little guardians of nutritional sanity. Books, if you were lucky enough to own a few, were read by flickering lamplight, the kind of flickering that made every sentence look like a mysterious clue in an Agatha Christie novel. Families would reread the same pages, not from lack of memory, but because once a story ran out, so did the entertainment. If nothing else, it made the Bible feel like a Netflix series with 20 seasons. And the Psalms, a musical number in every episode. Tales were told, usually by someone with a flair for drama and a flexible approach to facts. Uncle Silas, for example, swore he saw a bear reading a treaty upside down. The treaty was with another bear. No one questioned him too hard, because frankly, what else did one have to do after sundown? The isolation bred ingenuity. Socks were darned, then re-darned, until they began to resemble affectionate tubes held together by determination. Skis were carved out of fence planks, sleds formed from upside-down chairs. Geneva's 11-year-old son once turned a raccoon trap into a violin. It didn't sound like any violin anyone wanted to listen to, but it did make enough of a noise to scare off a fox. And for all that winter loomed like a frosty warden, it also wrapped the settlement in quiet ceremony. Winds would brush white powder from pine boughs, and from inside the logs and stone chimneys, breath and steam swirled together like smoke signals to the sky. Quilts grew as thick as mattresses. Crickets stopped chirping, replaced by the occasional crackle of frozen sap, splitting a nearby tree open like a sleepy magician's trick. They complained, of course. One couldn't live in winter's full embrace without muttering at least once a day about this dang snow or my left toe's betrayal. But they endured. Perhaps not because they were stoic, but because they already knew the next thaw would come. And when it did, oh, the joy of walking more than 20 feet without sinking like a soggy biscuit. But before that thaw, there was still January. And as the cold deepened and the world grew even quieter, it was time to gather close, feed the fire, and wait for the sound of the wind to change. Just enough to signal that the fox traps and violin practice might switch places again. Beyond the hill-frosted horizon, and well into the stubborn heart of the 18th century, a curious kind of quiet had begun to settle over the little settlement of Muckle Hollow. Named after an old Scots word meaning very big, Muckle Hollow was, with gentle irony, composed of precisely 7 houses, 1 millstone, and a goat that wandered so freely it was often accused of being the mayor. It was early December, which in settler terms meant it was basically February already. Snow came early in those days, like an audience member arriving 3 weeks before the show, then refusing to leave. The winter didn't exactly sneak in so much as it stomped through the door with muddy boots and made itself comfortable. And once it did, it became increasingly difficult to do the one thing survival rather depended on: leave. One of the more seasoned residents, Miss Liza Pendergrass, who once mistook a pack of wolves for parishioners and tried to offer them tea, was the nearest thing the Hollow had to a historian. She would sit beside her fireplace, knitting what may have been socks, or possibly just an extremely long handkerchief, and explain to the others how winter in the old world was a time to reflect, recharge, and catch lice. It brings folk together, she'd say, puffing clouds from a teacup that contained more snowmelt than actual tea, mostly by imprisoning them indoors. And indoors is exactly where the people of Muckle Hollow now found themselves. Separated from the outside world by chest-deep drifts and a bridge that decided it too needed a seasonal rest, they were unintentionally quarantined in what one settler described as a snow globe designed by someone spiteful. Months would pass before there'd be any travel again, and so the art of self-entertainment bloomed in all its underwhelming glory. There were dramatic readings of laundry lists. Folks began composing long, meandering songs about root vegetables. There were snowshoe races, which often turned into snowshoe collisions, followed by snowshoe apologies and the occasional snowshoe duel. But beyond the mild squabbles and blizzard-born boredom, something else began to form, something unexpected and rather sweet. The forced isolation led to a kind of accidental community cohesion. Before the snows, people often kept to themselves, more out of distraction than distance. But when you're snowed in with your neighbors, their oddities become entertainment, and their flaws, well, you learn to enjoy them. Like a favorite kettle that leaks but whistles in tune. Take old Jasper Winthrop, for instance. Jasper had the philosophical bearing of a Stoic, the vocabulary of a Shakespearean parrot, and the profound belief that all ailments could be cured with either garlic or gentle scolding. Trapped by ice and fate, Jasper became the town medic by default, and surprisingly, his patients survived. Mostly due to rest, but Jasper took full credit and began wearing a feather in his cap, claiming it was a healing plume. It did nothing, but it looked magnificent against the snowlight. Meanwhile, in her candlelit cabin, young Polly Muse took to inventing games to make the weeks pass faster. One such game, Guess the Smell, was both unpleasant and strangely compelling. Another, which involved tossing turnips into a bucket from across the room, became so fiercely competitive that wagers of mittens and jerky rations were commonplace. Even the livestock began displaying signs of cabin fever. Hens nested in absurd locations, pigs rearranged their straw with architectural precision, and the town's goat mare, Cabbage, mysteriously began appearing on rooftops. No one knew how. Frankly, no one wanted to ask. Food stores were managed with diligence bordering on obsession. Salt was sacred. Flour was a marital asset. There were rumored sightings of someone hoarding molasses in their chimney, but lacking any conclusive molasses trails. The matter remained unproven. Still, despite the cold and monotony, there was warmth to be found, not just by the fire, but in the shared glances during a communal meal, the laughter echoing from cabin to cabin, the intricate whispered bedtime stories told beneath patchy quilts. For in the great hush of winter, when roads disappeared and maps became little more than dreams of direction, settlers found something more enduring than trade goods or a letter from distant kin. They found rhythm, a slow, crunching cadence of togetherness, snow-muted and fire-bright. And though the wind would still rattle the window panes and the dark came early, stealing the sun like a stingy librarian, there remained something quietly marvelous about their strange wintry exile. Soon, the long nights would inspire not just games and garlic cures, but a whole new breed of curiosity. After all, when the world outside is buried in white, the mind begins to dig, down into the past, sideways into rumor, and occasionally deep into the tales of the oddly dressed traveler who'd arrived just before the last flake fell. There's a particular kind of silence that blankets a homestead once the snow claims both doorsteps and distance, not the noisy, modern kind filled with humming wires and central heating gurgles, but a deeper hush. In the 1830s, in the fir-fringed wildwood edges of Vermont, or the frigid shadows of the Ohio frontier, silence didn't just mean quiet. It meant the world had for a time politely excused itself. The settlers understood that once the snow arrived in earnest, falling in the fat, lazy manner of a cat that refuses to vacate your lap, travel, news, society, and even the mail would pause. The postman, if such a figure even frequented your corner of the wilderness, would likely be snowed into his own cabin sipping onion-flavored tea, a popular beverage of the time best enjoyed when one is both cold and extremely desperate. Communication became as slow as molasses in January, which, incidentally, settlers also stored in barrels outside during winter, where it became a seasonal delicacy with roughly the texture of a brick. Messages were often sent via runners, snowshoes fitted to their feet, mufflers pulled up to their eyebrows, and instructions whispered through scarves thick enough to stifle most vowels. Inside the cabin, the family adjusted to this wintry solitude with a strange and admirable cheer, like passengers in a snowbound spaceship fueled mostly by potatoes and stubbornness. Letters from distant cousins, fashion advice from relatives in Boston, blue is in vogue, as are boots with laces, and pamphlets warning of spiritual doom or fashionable etiquette might finally arrive by March, long after the sins or the fashion had passed. It was a different pace, one that required patience, and also a reliable woodpile. Firewood, by the way, wasn't just essential, it was practically currency. While today's weather forecast might advise a light jacket or share its tragedy in Celsius or Fahrenheit, back then settlers used the number of logs burned before sunrise system. It was deeply regional and wildly unscientific. One particularly frigid January, an upstate New Yorker famously burned through an entire fence and 2 regrets before breakfast. This sacred indoor life, the one that only happens when people are snowed in together, fostered both peace and increasingly eccentric inventions. Without the comforting chaos of visitors or obligations, minds wandered freely. One enterprising settler developed a daily calendar based entirely on which family members' socks froze first upon touching the floorboards. Another chronicled the snowpack against the window in poetry so abstract it terrified the chickens. And oh, the chickens. In summer, they were pecking, squawking, semi-respectable freeloaders. In winter, they became something closer to family. They were invited into the kitchen, or, in some cases, insisted upon entering with the unspoken authority of frozen royalty. They clucked solemnly near the stove, feathered judges presiding over supper by lantern light. For food, the menu rotated between whatever was root-cellared, pickled, or audibly shivering in its jar. Cabbage, bless its faithful heart, featured in ways both culinary and medicinal. Dried apples returned to life through boiling, a transformation not unlike the resurrection of morale during mid-February, when someone remembered where they stashed the sassafras tea. Time was told, not with clocks, but with weathered habits. The daylight anointed chores, while the moonlight, when it dared peek, invited stories. Once the children unfroze from wherever they had crammed themselves after chores, the family would gather for tales passed down from ancestors, as well as the occasional fireside drama involving mules, outhouses, or poorly planned baptisms in frozen creeks. And if you think boredom set in, you'd be both right and wrong. There was a lull, yes, but also a strange kind of richness to it. One could spend an afternoon embroidering initials on mittens that would surely be lost by spring, or whittling a spoon destined to stir soup with too many turnips and not enough anything else. Philosophical debates sprang up about whether one could, in fact, knit underwear with dignity, and if proper etiquette permitted sneezing in close cabins. Outside, the world slumbered beneath 3 feet of snow. Roads disappeared under the weight of giggling drifts. The trees, those tall, frosty hermits, stood still and reverent. Their branches bowed gently, not for surrender, but in shared agreement. We're all staying in until further notice. And so the cabin pulsed on, warm as a heartbeat beneath a quilted world. Not a civilization, but a constellation of tiny households scattered across the winter land, united by fireside, warmth, pickled cabbage, and the shared belief that life, frozen though it may be, still carried on. Stoke the coals a little and listen closer, because just down the trail, where the wind nests in the eaves of an even older cabin, something peculiar was unfolding. By late November, when the frost etched tiny empires on window panes and the snow stopped pretending to be cute, the settlers stared out into the pale wilderness and realized something with the full weight one might assign to an unpleasant tax audit. They weren't going anywhere. The roads had vanished, not blocked, not impassable, vanished, erased by snowdrift taller than men astride horses, disguised beneath layers of deceptive powder that looked charming only if you weren't responsible for feeding a family using a shovel and prayer. Travel ceased. Visitors ceased. Even the post ceased. Letters mailed in October now lounged lazily in some small-town depot, sipping imaginary cider, not to arrive until mid-April. In short, they were cut off from everything, except solitude and each other. Now, there's something deeply poetic about isolation when it's written about by 19th century poets in wool hats beside crackling hearths. But when you're living it, with sauerkraut as your most exciting dinner option, and the entertainment being a deeply unreliable family storytelling uncle, it leans less toward poetry and a touch more toward cabin fever. The average farming family suddenly found themselves with more time indoors, more proximity than perhaps anyone requested, and fewer options for politely excusing oneself. You couldn't say you had somewhere to be, not credibly. The door was frozen shut, so they adapted. The days slipped into quieter rhythms. Mornings began with the squeak of boots stiff from dry cold, and the soft protest of doors yielding to wool-smothered arms. Fires needed feeding before fires did any feeding in return. And once the crackling was suitably enthusiastic, it was time for the morning rituals. The porridge, the coffee where there had been tea, and someone sprinkling ashes on the step to keep from slipping into eternity. Idle hands being the devil's workshop, and the devil being extremely unemployed during the Scandinavian level winter, the settlers turned industrious indoors. Women took to mending socks with a look of grim determination usually reserved for duels. Men carved small wooden animals that bore only passing resemblance to anything found in nature, prompting plenty of whispered debates. Is it a horse or a pig with dreams? Children, miniature forces of entropy, were called upon to practice their letters, provided the ink hadn't frozen solid in the inkwell. On particularly thrilling afternoons, someone might recite the entire contents of an 1837 almanac aloud, because nothing says cozy winter evening like weather statistics and lunar forecasts from 4 years earlier. But before you assume it was all laughter and syrup, let's not forget one crucial reality: the diet. Winter diets, out of necessity, were a culinary love letter to root vegetables. Potatoes, more potatoes, some turnips for variety, sauerkraut because it wouldn't kill you, and, slightly more important, it might keep you from dying of scurvy. Occasionally, if one had been strategic in November, there was bacon, carefully rationed and admired more often than eaten. Treats were rare but sacred. A few preserved apples tucked away in sawdust, or some molasses-hard candy pulled from the back of the cupboard like treasure from a minimalist pirate. The joy this candy brought to a child was equal only to the sorrow of realizing you had to wait until your birthday or spring to get another one. And what about news, gossip, external intelligence? Entire months went by where the only outside information was from the family dog, who remained stoically unaware of global events. If someone 3 miles away had eloped with the blacksmith's daughter or discovered a new use for goose grease, settlers wouldn't know until long after that couple had children and the goose grease had gone out of fashion. Of course, necessity breeds some fascinating traditions. Winter storytelling became a vital survival tool, not just to pass the time, but to remember who you were before you heard your cousin snoring for the 100th consecutive night. Ghost stories, folk tales, family legends, and outright lies were spun with theatrical gravity, punctuated by the occasional drip of melting snow from the woolly coats hung near the fire. There was an intimacy, born not of romance, but of shared endurance. A knowing glance passed when someone managed to sweep snow off the roof without burying a sibling. A chuckle when someone tried to guess what day it was and came within 3 weeks. And always a reverent quiet when gazing out into the white abyss where fences had disappeared and the world slumbered beneath layers of patient, muffled time. By the time February arrived and the snow took on that exhausted grey hue, like a guest who's overstayed their welcome but still won't pick up their things, the whispers of spring stirred, even in the most skeptical among them. But before that great thaw, the settlers faced one more challenge: surviving the midwinter lull, when tempers shortened and firewood followed suit. By the time the snow had reached their bootlaces and politely requested to borrow their knees for the season, the settlers had resigned themselves to what winter truly meant: full sensory suspension of anything resembling progress. Roads turned to suggestion, trade routes disappeared into the white abyss, and letters from back east might as well have been whispers into a snowbank. This wasn't the beginning of the end. No. It was merely the ceremonial freezing of all normality. Inside the creaky wooden homes assembled more out of hope than experience, families began their winter rituals. These included stacking firewood like it might form its own little army to battle the chill, and vigorously auditing their root cellars as if they might find a surprise pie from last harvest. They never did. Entertainment took the form of watching frost creep across the window pane, narrating the icy patterns as if they were soap operas. Ooh, look, that one's about to take the high road and merge with the swirly fellow from the left pane. Scandalous. The settlers, cut off from the outside world, discovered that time moved differently in the snow. Days melted into one another like candle wax on a warm stovetop, and calendars devolved into vague estimations based on the freshness of the preserved venison. Children whispered questions like, was there really a sun, or was that just a story Pa told back in November? To pass the time, neighbours occasionally glimpsed one another from across snow-covered fields, waving cheerily like Arctic explorers who had spotted another human for the first time in weeks. Social visits still happened, though they were rarer than summer squash in January. People bundled into so many layers to make the journey that it became less of a visit and more of a fabric-based transformation. No fewer than 3 settlers reportedly arrived at friends' cabins completely unable to bend their elbows, asking to be unwrapped like overcautious Christmas gifts. Mail delivery, remarkably, continued in some regions, though the concept of prompt delivery was frostbitten beyond recognition. If someone received a letter saying congratulations on your marriage, it was statistically likely to arrive around the time their first child started asking questions about metaphysics. And the mail carriers? Oh, those brave souls wrestled with snowdrifts taller than their horses, often performing daily Shakespearean monologues to their sled dogs just to stay awake. But isolation didn't just stretch east to west. It grew within the walls of the homes themselves. Winter turned even the jolliest family gatherings into thespian performances of silent seething. Uncle Harmon, who'd once been the life of the barn dance, now oversaw the rate of molasses consumption with military discipline. "That's a 2-swipe pour, not 3, warned. "You think we're swimming in syrup here?" Children invented elaborate indoor sports like blanket slide and ceiling stair. Meanwhile, older siblings rediscovered the lost art of dramatized yarn winding, turning it into full-scale productions that included musical numbers and the occasional puppet. With little to do but think, talk, and occasionally argue about who moved the soup pot last, many settlers stumbled upon philosophical revelations. Some pondered the nature of warm socks in relation to mortality. Others debated whether the walls were actually closing in, or if the logs were simply swelling with moisture. Outside, the snow piled higher. Log cabins resembled little hats resting on fluffy white pillows, and chimneys puffed smoke like disoriented thought bubbles. Wildlife, too, had retreated into a state of deep winter diplomacy, with squirrels and snow hares resolving to disagree about territory until March. Even the wind, once sharp enough to sever your optimism, grew into a lazy drawl, more likely to hum lullabies through the cracks in the wall than bellow threats across the fields. And still, each night, fires crackled merrily, offering small defiance against the cold. The settlers found a rhythm in their exile, a sleepy trudging toward spring, one spoonful of pickled cabbage at a time. They had traded chatter for stillness, hustle for hibernation. And along the way, they stumbled on a curious truth. Sometimes being cut off from the world was less like a prison and more like a snow globe. Quiet, small, and filled with its own sort of sparkle. In the coming weeks, that sparkle would be tested by shortages, tempers, and one rather suspicious wheel of cheese. But for now, the night was calm, the roof secure, and the porridge tolerably warm. Just outside the window, the snow fell with the attentiveness of someone painting the world for a bedtime story not quite finished. Once the snow began to pile up past the knees of fully grown oxen, and I assure you, colonial oxen were nothing to scoff at. It stopped being a season and started being a personality trait. Winter didn't visit early settlements. Winter moved in, kicked its boots off, and asked what's for dinner. By the time January arrived in the more remote outposts of colonial America, places whose modern descendants still get less than reliable GPS signals, the settlers were more or less glorified squirrels in people clothes. They had gathered what they could, stored it under stairs and inside chimneys, and now proceeded to make it last 3 times longer than sounded mathematically fair. The art of stretching supplies became the closest thing those communities had to high cuisine. One Rhode Island pamphlet from the late 1600s describes a winter stew recipe that included salted pork, dry beans, chiseled potatoes, and something called root of uncertain origin. Entire families would debate whether that root was a turnip or a vaguely cooperative rock, but in the end, it went into the pot, and nobody perished. At least, not from the stew directly. While cut off from the world by impassable snowdrifts and roads more suited for sled dogs than humans, communities became their own very quiet, very cold ecosystems. Life turned inward. Visitors ceased. Weekly sermons doubled in length, not because people became more devout, but because the church was the only public building with a fireplace, and folks weren't about to leave until their kneecaps could flex again. To pass the interminable hours, people had to invent not only entertainment, but the very idea of being entertained, and thus unfolded the era of what we might call dramatically underwhelming indoor activities. We're talking lard candle carving contests, competitive porridge stirring, and, in one infamous case, a month-long game of guess who took the last herring. Families would recount stories to one another, especially the kind that aged more majestically each time they were told. That time Mama outran a bear became the far more thrilling tale of how she tamed the bear, taught it to churn butter, and then kindly sent it on its way with slippers and a blessing. Applause followed, even if the storyteller's audience was just two sleepy toddlers and an elderly aunt with hearing like slightly damp wool. Education didn't stop either, though it did hibernate. Children learned which wood gave off the most heat, how to shovel to the privy without losing hope, and what herbs might trick the body into thinking it had eaten more than one turnip slice. Adolescents may have been taught their letters, but only if they finished their chore of beating the rugs so furiously it felt personal. Trapping and foraging persisted, but became what polite society might call reactive decision-making. If a rabbit was spotted on the edge of the woods, there was no dignified hunting strategy, just 20 pairs of boots shuffling out as a large, awkward posse, trying not to make the snow groan and give them away. Of course, there were the diaries. Oh, the glorious, mildly dramatic winter diaries. Settlers poured their thoughts, dreams, and creeping cabin fever into leather-bound journals. Day 9 of snow imprisonment, one candle-warmed entry might read. Breadstocks dangerously low. Found pencil shavings strangely aromatic. Another. Have begun speaking to my mittens. Mitten left is an optimist. Mitten right suspects sabotage. Yet even in these quiet, frostbitten stretches of isolation, a sense of rhythm emerged that gave order to chaos. Morning involved heavy sighs and layered dressing sessions that felt more like tailoring a small sofa than getting dressed. Afternoons were reserved for scraping ice, melting snow for tea, and staring longingly at where the sun should be. Evening came early, and so did supper. A clanging together of all surviving root vegetables and a slab of something baconesque. Night wasn't for sleep. Not yet. Night belonged to stories, laughter that made beards tremble, and that half-awake togetherness best described as, we've made it another day, so why not dance with a broom? And despite the shadows clawing against the windows, the wind writing threats on the cabin walls, and the overwhelming desire to be literally anywhere south of Albany, the people endured, in flannel and silence, in songs about gooseberry pies and heroic chickens and completely fictional bread feasts, they endured. Tomorrow, they hoped, would bring either a thaw or at least a squirrel that looked slightly overconfident. And with that flickering candlelight still warming, one cheek more than the other, they dozed into softer hours, minds already drifting toward the next odd solution to the age-old question: how to outwit the winter, one cup of weak tea at a time. A snow-covered roof can make certain creaks sound like ghost stories, especially when you're 50 miles from the nearest other human being, and the guest bedroom is a hayloft shared with 3 goats and a lopsided barrel of pickled beets. And yet, as settlers began inhabiting increasingly remote corners of colonial North America, many folks considered these drafty little log homes to be luxurious because they had something not everyone did: a roof, even a leaky one. By the time December rolled in, cabins across the backwoods were less pioneer chic and more panic chic. The friendly rustle of wind through the trees slowly transformed into a daily siege of hissing snow and the occasional dramatic thump. Usually, a raccoon misjudging a jump, or in rarer cases, a possum misjudging everything. Outside was no longer a place one visited unless it was absolutely necessary, like using the, frosted wooden throne out back. Yes, we're talking about the outhouse, a structure best described as a bench with ambition. Inside the cabin, families huddled around the hearth like it was a benevolent sun god, buttering what little bread they had left and quietly calculating how many turnips one should eat per week to avoid both starvation and madness. The answer, by the way, was 3, and never on Thursdays, because that was when the turnip weevils tended to hatch. One had to keep track of these things. Much of wintertime life for settlers wasn't about thriving. It was about waiting for the snow to melt, for the creeks to flow again, for letters from home to finally arrive, usually in May, and for the inevitable moment when someone tried to use the butter churn as a drum in a fit of boredom. Because you see, winter isolation had a peculiar way of fermenting eccentric behavior. Today, we might call it cabin fever. Back then, it was just called mid-February. Still, time didn't have to pass unproductively. Many settlers took up wintertime crafts, often because there was nothing else to do, but also, quite frankly, because you couldn't listen to Uncle Horace retell the story of wrestling a raccoon for the 5th evening in a row without needing something to stitch, whittle, or quietly unravel. Quilting circles were formed, though most included precisely one tired woman, a baby gnawing on a thimble, and a cat that slept exclusively on whatever material was most in use. Men tended to craft tools, axes, fishing lures, snowshoes that only looked symmetrical, and some even tried their hand at poetry, which was always considered a sign that the flour had run out. Children, naturally, found ways to entertain themselves. This included carving dolls from firewood, learning the harmonica to varying degrees of neighborhood approval, and inventing the snow-based version of tag, which someone always managed to turn into a full-on brawl involving mittens packed with loosely frozen slush. There were few rules except don't trip into the root cellar and try not to lose a mitten. It won't be replaced until 1773. As the snow piled higher and the daylight grew shorter, the family's most prized possession became not the musket or the iron kettle, but the almanac, the trusty pamphlet that offered weather predictions, mostly wrong, farming advice, sometimes useful, and short little essays on such meaningful subjects as how to tell if your neighbor is dead or just very cold. Reading by the firelight, bundled in layers of wool, a family could pretend, for a while, that the outside world hadn't frozen solid, that the cornfields would bloom again, that perhaps, just perhaps, this year, the bay wouldn't stay iced over into June. Hope, like sourdough starter and bad fiddle playing, was a common household ingredient. And through it all, there was talk. Some whispered memories of warmer months, of sun-dried apples and river fording gone wrong. Some told stories of distant lands, like Boston, or exciting inventions rumored to exist, such as a stove that heated both sides of the room. Blasphemous. A particularly daring cousin once spoke of canned peaches, and the room went so quiet you could hear the goat blinking. In these quiet, snowy months of stillness, what truly warmed the long nights wasn't just the fire. It was the small rituals, the shared stories, the laughter that floated like candle smoke above a steaming bowl of stew. Life, after all, refused to freeze. And so, While the trees outside wore their shawls of snow and the wind composed symphonies through chinks in the wall, families waited, wintered, and dreamed, little knowing that outside, where the path had disappeared beneath 2 feet of powder and hope, something was moving, 4-legged, shaggy, and possibly edible. But we'll whisper more about that after the next snowdrift. The world outside had turned white, not the tidy, picturesque white of a holiday postcard, but the kind of white that rearranges your life plans without asking. By early January, the few scattered settlements of the northern frontier were officially snowbound. No stagecoaches, no letters, no visits from neighbors unless they came by sleigh. And even then, the kind of neighborly chit-chat you got in deep winter was less. How's your mother? And more. Did your chimney collapse yet? In the log cabins and sod houses dotted across the frontier, supplies were carefully rationed as though the cupboard had become a stage for an ongoing diplomatic negotiation. Flour was measured not in cups, but in deep sighs. Salt was treated like gold dust. And if you had coffee, real coffee, not ground up roasted chicory with delusions of grandeur, you were either very lucky or very recently robbed. Let us imagine one such cabin, half buried in snow, smoke curling from the chimney, and windows rimmed with frost. Inside, a family of 5 huddled around the stove like planets clinging to a warm sun. Everything slowed in winter, except time, which had a habit of stretching. Games were invented. Long before television, pre-bedtime entertainment involved the naming of icicles or competitive potato peeling. Sometimes Uncle Seth would get out his fiddle, but only if he was in a mood, and only if someone else offered to churn the butter tomorrow. Cabin fever was both an inside joke and not a joke at all. It was what happened when the days grew dark too early, and your only social contact was your immediate relatives and your own slowly unraveling mind. Some settlers swore they saw dancing lights on the snowbanks. Others took to rearranging the furniture daily, convinced it altered cabin temperature. And once in a while, someone would announce they were going outside to check on the fence, which translated roughly to, "I need 5 minutes of screaming into the wind." Still, there was something elemental, almost sacred, about being cut off from the world. The snow enclosed their lives like a bookend, the fierce white quiet pressing out the clamor of markets, telegrams, and men arguing over corn futures. Here, no one cared if the president had changed his hair. Out here, politics were limited to the hot debate between Grandma's stew and Ma's dumplings. Spoiler, the stew always won, because Grandma was armed with stories of the blizzard of '52 and a terrifying ladle. They created their own rituals for the long nights. Some sang, others quilted, embroidered, or whittled more wooden spoons than could ever possibly be used in a single household, unless forks were outlawed. Reading aloud was a treasured group activity, provided someone hadn't used the last remaining volume of Charles Dickens to patch a draft near the window. The family Bible served double duty as a spiritual guide and a remarkably effective heat insulator when pressed against the chest during particularly gusty nights. Meanwhile, wildlife had its own winter routines. The raccoons were asleep under the barn. The foxes had vanished into the dreaming woods, and the bears were off somewhere, doing perhaps the most enviable thing imaginable, hibernating without guilt, noise, or the need to settle disputes over the last usable chamber pot. When storms roared through, as they often did, the entire world shifted into a muffled dreamscape. Snow piled so high against the door that it might be mistaken for a new wall. It was the kind of weather that made soup taste like salvation and storytelling feel like survival. And even then, life found a way to keep itself entertained. Children drew elaborate dramas into frost-laced windows. One particularly inventive youngster once reenacted the entire Lewis and Clark expedition in smudged fingerdoodles, with a potato as Sacagawea. Adults would spin yarns so complicated that no one could remember if they started out as autobiographical or wholly invented by the time the fire crackled low. Sometimes someone would wonder aloud how things were back east. A casual curiosity hung in the air like pipe smoke, but only briefly. The truth was, they were exactly where they needed to be, nestled deep in winter's pocket, removed from the roar and grind of the outside world, and in its place, quiet, reflection, and the soothing creak of timber settling into the rhythm of the season. Outside, a fox trotted across the moonlit snow, light-footed and unconcerned. Inside, a kettle hissed gently on the stove, and someone began to hum a tune they half remembered from somewhere warmer, or perhaps from a dream. As sleet began to tap a slow lullaby on the rooftop, the horizon promised even colder days ahead, and with them, new strategies for keeping warm, sane, and just a little bit amused. Somewhere in the rolling silence of early January, with the snow crusting like sugar over every roof and a wagon wheel, the settlement began to notice that nobody was visiting anymore. Not from the next clearing, not from the town down the river. Even errant moose seemed to have stopped dropping by. At first, this was met with some relief. Finally, a break from social obligations and the neighbors' unsolicited banjo solos. But as time wore on, the realization set in. Winter had cut them off completely. Again. It was not an uncommon occurrence. In fact, early settlers in many parts of North America had a name for this annual isolation. It wasn't poetic. It was just called the Deep Winter, which sounds like the title of a Jack London novella or a particularly bleak candle scent. During these weeks, sometimes months, the outside world receded like a tide, leaving behind only the things you'd thought to bring in beforehand. Firewood, salt pork, flour, several thousand pickles, and, ideally, everyone you liked. When a snowstorm blocked the few cart paths out of town, settlers responded in the traditional way, shoveling until they realized the snow was coming in faster than it was going out, then slowly backing into their homes and pretending not to hear it. Mail delivery ceased. Goods stopped arriving. The last known bakery shipment, half a dozen hard rolls and a letter from someone's aunt about geese, had come by sleigh a week before. The sleigh could no longer get through. Inside the houses, people began to adjust. This is where settler ingenuity began to shine, or at least flicker in a vaguely competent way. Eggs were stored in barrels of lard and cellars were treated like VIP lounges for turnips. Rugs were hung on walls to keep the insulation in and the gossip out. Evenings were spent by the hearth, playing games that required no more equipment than a stick and an argument. One popular winter pastime was Guess Who's Coming Downstairs, in which someone would creak down with a candle, and the rest had to guess whether it was Pa with firewood or someone else chasing the rats again. Clocks in these homes ticked heavily, the only real machinery in a day mostly powered by hope, mittens, and soup. And soup, oh, there was a lot of it. If it could be boiled, it was dinner. One woman reportedly made soup from a recipe that included whatever's in the third jar on the second shelf, a flexible, intuitive dish she called February stew. It was in this forced pause, this hush of snow over the world, that new rhythms emerged. Days were no longer measured in hours, but in stove warmth intervals and how many socks one could rotate through while drying others near the fire. Letters might be written, though not mailed. Continued education for the children might be attempted, though school of freezing kitchen table was a rather grumpy institute. Lessons were patched together from memory, old books, and the opinions of anyone over the age of 30 who seemed convincing at the time. Settlers found that boredom was not to be feared, but carefully cultivated, like a strange plant that blooms into creativity. One man carved an entire chess set out of potato chunks. Another woman rewrote Shakespeare into limericks because, in her words, there had to be a way to make Hamlet faster. Outside, the snow deepened, wood piles shrank, and with each passing day the quiet got thicker. Like syrup poured over a pancake you absolutely meant to ration, but didn't. Around this point, hallucination and poetry often met in the middle. Folks claimed to see ghost horses, just plumes of mist up the road, or heard old fiddle music groaning faintly through the trees. No one could confirm any of this, but everyone agreed it really did feel like something was out there. Probably just a moose. Yet despite the cold and the disconnection, something curious happened in those cut-off weeks. People started to listen to each other, not because they were necessarily interested, but because they had run out of ways to avoid each other. And in that reluctant closeness, bonds were woven silently, like frost patterns on a window pane. By the end of January, a sort of practiced coziness had taken hold. No one was comfortable exactly, but everyone seemed to know how to be uncomfortable in a more pleasant way, which arguably is the entire skill set of making it through winter. And as the candles burned lower and the snow pressed lightly on their roofs like a soft, cold hand tucking them in, many settlers blinked up at the rafters and thought, that wasn't so bad. Maybe next year we'll even prepare. Maybe. Somewhere in the walls, a squirrel sneezed. Someone noted it in the ledger. We will now drift onward as the hush of winter continues toward what happens when supplies finally begin to run low, and settlers start thinking creatively, while snowflakes clung to windows like curious frozen starfish, and fireplaces murmured their ancient lullabies. Settlers in the winter wilderness turned inward, not just into their homes, but into their own peculiar winter minds. Winter isolation was not just about survival. It was about learning to live with oneself, and perhaps even more challengingly, with one's uncle, who insisted on retelling the same Revolutionary War story every evening, with increasing personal involvement in the plot. By February, he had apparently single-handedly negotiated the Treaty of Paris. Within those biting icicle-framed cabins, entertainment became an exercise in imagination, repetition, and tolerance. Board games, no such luxury. Instead, people played games like Throw the Button at the Slipper, or Guess How Many Beans I've Counted in My Hand. A surprisingly high-stakes game, considering beans were food and counting was a respectable form of passing time. Reading was a refuge, though books were few. A single volume might serve an entire family for a season, its pages treated like precious relics, its spine worn soft from winter fingers. A tattered almanac might be passed around, read again and again, until someone finally dared disagree with its lunar predictions, sparking what was considered a wild intellectual debate. Music thankfully required only a willing voice, or, if one was truly blessed, a fiddle. Ah yes, the settler's violin. Not precisely in tune, but deeply spirited. It wailed cheerfully through the darkness, wedged between sleepy harmonies and foot stomps on wooden floors. The rhythm was often faster than strictly recommended within confined wooden structures heated by open flames. But winter was long, and reckless joy was permitted in small, stompy doses. There was also storytelling, always storytelling, a combination of truth, fiction, and whatever Grandpa remembered after 3 sips of cider. Ghost stories were particularly in vogue, since nothing countered freezing toes like a tale of spectral footsteps crunching in the snow just outside the door. A famous one in the northern settlements involved the Lantern Lady, a shimmering figure seen wandering hillsides after blizzards, searching for her lost bonnet and mumbling about forgetting to feed the chickens. It was a haunting tale, though rather gentler than the bone-chilling horrors you might expect. More mildly exasperated ghost mom than vengeful spirit. But while isolation invoked creativity, it also occasionally birthed curious cabin logics, such as, if we're out of candles, perhaps we can render more from that mysterious barrel of animal fat in the shed. Short-term solutions, long-term regrets. That barrel had a story, and it was never entirely clear whose animal it originally belonged to. Time, in this snowy world, moved differently. Days lost their edges. Without sunlight to neatly divide hours, people found themselves drifting, sleeping at odd times, eating by candlelight at both dawn and dusk, occasionally unsure which was which. The sun, when visible, was more of a polite acquaintance than a reliable friend during these months. Calendars were largely ceremonial. You might cross off a date only to realize 2 days later that you'd missed 3. Time was measured in granary levels, beard length, and how many times one had remended the mittens. Children grew taller, and no one noticed until their heads started brushing against the ceiling beams. Still, tucked tightly in their timber cocoons, the settlers became masters of adaptation, sewing into the night, carving spoons for no particular reason, gathering around to recite the alphabet, just for the joy of consistent, reliable vowels. Winter may have cut them off from the world, but it stitched them more firmly to each other. Around the hearth, conspiracies brewed. Little ones, like which child had sneaked the last molasses biscuit, or whether neighbor Hiram had actually built that new chimney, or just waited until spring to lie about it. These small mysteries kept the mind alert, or at least pleasantly percolating, until the next snowfall reduced everything again to silence and soup. A stillness would often settle over everything in the late hours, as frost painted the inside of windows and the fire gave its last sigh-like crackles. That was when one might step outside just briefly, swaddled in wool and curiosity. The stars would spill thick above, and the snow would hush the world so deeply you could hear your own footsteps ask questions. Questions like, why did Aunt Liddy start storing apples in the bed straw? And what, exactly, was that sound last night in the root cellar? But such thoughts were better left for another evening. For now, the cabin rested. Even in isolation, there was warmth. In boredom, there was creativity. And in the slow slide of wintertime hours, a peculiar peace. And somewhere under the snow-covered roofs, someone was preparing yet another game of I Spy, Walnut Edition. Soon, though, the settlers' patience and their supply of salt pork would truly be tested. When temperatures plunged and supplies waned, they would turn to one of winter's most dramatic culinary practices, improvisation. But that's another tale, and the pot's just warming up. All things considered, it wasn't the wolves or the snowstorms that posed the greatest challenge to a settler's winter survival. It was cabin fever, a condition so perilously cozy that it crept in unnoticed, like a raccoon invited politely into the parlour and then given a job on the council. When you're 6 people living in a wooden box the size of a modern SUV, your options for entertainment quickly dwindle. Board games hadn't been invented yet, and even if they had, no one had the patience to whittle 400 tiny Monopoly hotels out of pine. Reading was an excellent pastime, provided the family owned more than one book, and most didn't. The Bible may have seen 7 readings before breakfast, sparking theological debates between children who couldn't yet spell Noah. Still, the human spirit is hard to cage. Settlers improvised. Shadows on the Wall, a thrilling epic involving a goose and what might genuinely have been a demon. Old Papa Jed's tales became more elaborate with each snowfall, drifting further from fact with every blizzard. By February, he was telling the children he'd ridden into the valley on a moose, wielding twin axes fashioned from falling stars. They didn't believe him, of course, but they listened, nestled together under itchy wool and hope. Meals took hours not because they were gourmet, but because stretching the act of boiling potatoes until sunset counted as both survival and evening entertainment. A well-timed sneeze could reset dinner conversation for 20 minutes, and if anyone fell asleep with a ladle in hand, they'd be declared tonight's king and given first dibs on the least frozen blanket. Candles were precious, and settlers learned to regulate the mood with just one flickering flame. It made everyone look mysterious, like a family of mildly haunted ghosts. And if you've never played charades in tongue-numbing cold, with only candlelight and a suspicious raccoon watching from above the pantry shelf, then my friend, you haven't lived like a pioneer. One odd comfort was the family time. Yes, it was enforced by inclement weather and the existential need to share body heat, but many a bond was forged during storms that bent barn beams and danced with the fences. The youngest learned to sew. The oldest resisted the urge to disappear into the snow. Even the goats were brought inside sometimes, which made for one warm yet judgmental audience during storytelling hours. Letters, when they could be written, became heartfelt epics, part journal, part weather report, part plea for anyone to send socks. "Dearest cousin," one settler might write, "it is day 17 of snow. We have begun naming the icicles. The one by the window is Gregory, and he is, we all agree, the most majestic of the bunch. But beyond the absurdity and the chill, there was a kind of poetry to these winters, a rhythm of watching, waiting, tending, repeating. The chores didn't stop just because your boots froze in the shape of despair. Animals still needed feeding, ice needed breaking, and someone had to make sure little Edward didn't eat the medicinal soap again. He always did. It was mint-scented. Community was something one imagined fondly while staring out of frost-laced windows. Neighbours might live just a mile away, but winter turned every journey into a Tolkien-esque expedition. If you saw someone mid-January, it was cause for celebration, preferably with actual sugar, if such dangerous luxuries still remained. Whispers of upcoming spring gatherings became mythic: barn dances, quilting bees, events where people other than your immediate family might possess functional social skills. And so, to survive winter wasn't simply about tending the hearth and rationing the beans. It was about tending oneself and each other in small, peculiar ways. A foot rub here, a shared memory there. Someone chipping ice just to sculpt a crude smiling face into it. Because even frozen water deserves some cheer. Outside, the wind howled like a theatre critic unimpressed. Trees groaned under the weight of snow and time. But inside, beneath patched quilts and the aroma of something edible adjacent, the settlers endured. Not cheerfully, not always gracefully, but enduring nonetheless, with goats and moose tails and the occasional raccoon soul-searching during supper. As the days inched longer, and they always did, however slowly, so too did whispers of spring begin to rustle in straw-stuffed pillows and the hearts of those who had waited. But before the thaw, before the mud and the age-old trials of planting, there remained one element of frozen, frontier life not yet explored, and it too came with its share of secrets and snowflakes. With the snow now burying the thoroughfares and silence reigning thicker than stew in the pot, the winter cabin had become its own floating island in a sea of white. And like any good island, it bred a unique set of customs, legends, and indoor-only hobbies, the best of which was the diary of James Fletcher, age 52, reluctant pioneer, and even more reluctant ice chopper. It was discovered years later wedged behind a curing ham, which we'll admit isn't the usual place for autobiographical treasure. But there it was, wrapped in waxed cloth and written in meticulous block letters, as if James suspected that his descendants would all be squinting near-blind fools. He was probably right. Now, James wasn't a particularly gifted writer, nor was he very fond of punctuation. But what the man lacked in semicolons he made up for in sheer devotion to narrating the mundane tragedies of being, thoroughly, enthusiastically, snowbound. December 17th, he wrote, "Tried baking bread, used salt instead of sugar. Everyone now hates breakfast. Anna suspects treason." December 20th, "Icicles above outhouse look ready to fall. Refuse to make eye contact." December 23rd, "Had to explain chess again. No one trusts that the horse moves in an L shape. I know what I saw." He created entire debates about whether a frostbitten toe could be considered injured or retired, and spearheaded the now long-forgotten effort to classify soup as a regional dialect, possibly caused by lack of sleep and definite lack of garlic. But James wasn't alone in his cabin-induced madness. Across the frontier, in thousands of little wooden boxes perched on frozen earth, families were learning lessons in the peculiar intimacy of winter. For example, the art of silent quilting, a task so tedious, so excruciatingly repetitive, that it held a sacred place in spiritual tradition. Legend claimed if you quilted long enough without complaint, you would ascend directly to heaven, or at least to the upstairs bedroom. There were also the phenomena of whittler's disputes, where, in the absence of any actual news or visitors, competing versions of gossip were carved into wooden spoons. Aunt Eliza said the Jones family had gotten their cow stuck on the roof, while Uncle Ethan insisted it was the Carter family's ox, and it was stuck under the root cellar. Each side whittled their tale with flair, passing the spoons between households by sled-pulled child. These were the months when a well-timed sneeze could trigger an entire afternoon's suspicion. That sounded like German sneezing. And when old songs grew new verses, usually driven by the desperate attempt to rhyme hoarfrost with anything. More cost, chores lost. It was a dark time. The comforting truth, though, was that the human brain, when trapped in an 18 by 18 foot space with 5 relatives and a marmot in the ceiling, becomes marvelously creative. The youngest child might compose symphonies using spoons, pans, and the unbending will of boredom. The eldest might revive the forgotten sport of indoor pioneer curling, which was just firewood sliding across floorboards with enthusiastic yelling. There was also a fair amount of philosophical debate during these icicle-laden months. Was it still Monday if no one could prove it? Could stew be considered a 5th season? and the eternal conundrum. If a bear freezes mid-snore, is it technically still hibernating? Some settlers used these long white nights to write letters they would never send. Others used them to remember every lyric they could from their childhood. One man, forever nameless, due to some light scandal attached to tanning hides indoors, spent the entire winter inventing games played entirely on tables made of frozen bacon. The cold, you see, did something curious to people. It made them strange, wonderfully so. It sculpted perseverance into their muscles and put poetry in their grumbling. The boredom, the drafts, the endless, crunchy, nose-freezing stillness, they were all part of the alchemy that turned ordinary hardship into folklore. So while the snow piled quietly against windows, framing the world in blue and white, life within carried on, strange, echoing, slightly spicy with desperation. The world outside may have paused, but inside, humans were busy being, well, humans. And somewhere, deep in the hush of a frozen stovepipe morning, you might have heard the soft scratching of a spoon carving one last opinion into wood, or smelled the questionable victory of second-day stew, hearty, sour and proud. What these isolated pockets of civilization didn't yet know was that, beyond the burying drifts and the groan of bowing rafters, other settlements were beginning to trade winter secrets of their own. Secrets we'll explore next, tracing the quiet chords of ingenuity that hum between chimney smoke and snow-crusted wood piles. In the early days of January, when the frost clung to cabin shutters like a particularly stubborn houseguest, the settlers faced the most ominous of threats. Leisure time. Oh, they wouldn't have called it that. They would have insisted they were snowbound or between workloads, which was old-timey code for "we've done all we can do" and the snowdrifts up to the roof eaves. But truly, for a people raised on the Protestant work ethic and something suspiciously similar to hay-based coffee, idle hands were the devil's knitting needles. And so, they found ways to fill the long, frozen hours. Some took to whittling, carving elaborate animal figurines, or, more commonly, vaguely animal-shaped blobs that only slightly resembled squirrels, but were praised anyway. The key with winter crafts was not art, it was distraction. If your fingers were occupied, they weren't realizing just how numb they were. Others turned to storytelling, huddled around the hearth with cheeks red from wind and firelight. Grandfather would lean in, eyes twinkling above wiry brows, and say something deeply unsettling like, "And then the Wendigo came." You could always count on some healthy supernatural folklore to keep the children awake with fear rather than cold. And if there was an old fiddle in the house, which there almost always was, because every third pioneer claimed to have been quite musical before the wagon, then someone would draw a creaky tune from its strings, scratchy and slow, like the ghost of a barn dance drifting through a woolen sock. Meanwhile, diaries swelled with ink-heavy entries. Winter was peak journaling season. With the fields buried, it was time to document the previous year with a flourish. Although due to poor penmanship and ink that froze stiff mid-sentence, much of it reads today like January 12th, sheep gone, made soup. A level of brevity Twitter would envy. There was also the uniquely frontier phenomenon of visiting, which was more of an expedition than a social call. The settlers would trudge through 2 feet of snow, wearing homemade boots stuffed with straw, declaring, "Thought we'd just drop by," as though they hadn't nearly perished from exposure on the half-mile walk. Once inside, everyone stared into their teacups, unsure what to say that hadn't already been said the week before. So the silence was broken only by the sounds of steaming mittens and reluctant conversation. not unlike today's holiday family gatherings, but with more snow and less Wi-Fi. And yet, winter did something remarkable. It slowed time down. In a world that otherwise raced with planting, harvesting, cooking, and mending, this season paused the rush. One might even say it imposed a gentle tyranny of stillness, turning each ticking moment into something more thoughtful, even sacred. It was under these conditions that people became surprisingly profound. Letters were written with a poet's sense of drama. Recipes passed down like sacred scrolls. Courtships were often kindled, because truth be told, when you're stuck indoors and young Silas brings over a jar of preserved pears, well, you start to reconsider your views on matrimony. Even the family spinning wheel became a kind of meditative hum, its rhythmic whir echoing like the winds outside, until the two blended into one solemn sound of survival. Of course, not every hour was calm. Cabin fever, despite the charming name, was a real condition. An entire family crammed into a single room for months without privacy could unearth new depths of frustration. Even butter churning could spark arguments after a while. "You churn too enthusiastically, Judith," was a sentence that, once spoken, changed the mood of a cabin forever. Still, these were the moments that shaped folks. Winter, with its quiet and its teeth, taught them patience, resilience, and an appreciation for the sound of spring thawing through the walls. As snowflakes continued to fall in great swirling herds outside those drafty log homes, and lamplight flickered against frost-glazed windows, families settled in. Quilts pulled higher, whispers softened. Someone would yawn, always a trusted signal, and then the room grew hushed. Yet even as sleep claimed the weary homesteaders, the wilderness beyond their walls had plans of its own. The wolves had crept closer, not in menace, but drawn to the same hush, the same heat, the same stillness that wrapped everything in winter's patient hold. Despite what modern imaginations might conjure, the earliest American winters were not spent in charming log cabins, sipping cider beside roaring hearths. Certainly not by those first unlucky groups of settlers who found themselves isolated by the season's icy hand. For most, winter was not so much a season as it was a silent siege upon the senses. And depending on which year we're talking about, sometimes even upon sanity itself. Picture, if you will, the winter of 1780. In what meteorologists, many centuries later, would refer to as absurdly cold, the Hudson River actually froze solid. Not a soft sheet of frost or an aesthetically pleasing skating rink. We're talking full-on, horse cart crossing, cannon hauling ice. General Washington, never one to miss a strategic opportunity or a dramatic cold snap, marched troops across it. One wonders if any poor soul attempted to toss pebbles beforehand just to be sure it was safe. There aren't many diary entries featuring the line, "General was nervous. Corporal Jenkins did the stone test. All clear." Settlers in the more remote corners of New England were less concerned with icy troop logistics and more concerned with survival, which, frankly, required significant daily improvisation, like waking up to find their ink frozen in the inkwell, writing loving letters home, delayed until defrost. Water buckets indoors would freeze overnight, meaning that lazy midnight trips for a drink were not just inconvenient, they were crunchy. And if you think your cold bathroom floor in the morning is unpleasant, try an 18th century outhouse in February. Fuel was everything in those days. Wood was currency, warmth, and hope. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just for ambience, it was for life. Folks developed an almost spiritual relationship with their hearths. It wasn't just where food was cooked, It was where conversations happened, babies were born, disputes were settled, and occasionally where someone's eyelashes froze shut mid-sentence. In the better organized homes, the winter pantry had been carefully stocked back in the fall with root vegetables, dried meats, and pies that could withstand both time and extreme emotional repression. Apple cider was pressed and stored in wooden barrels, not merely for merriment, but because watery drinks froze. Cider held out longer. There's a reason colonial America ran on fermented beverages and increasingly vague hopes. Yet, it wasn't all woeful trudging and chattering teeth. Winter also brought its own peculiar brand of social entertainment. Quilting circles became vital, if slightly scandalous. Let us not forget that communal activities meant warmth, proximity, and whispered gossip. Quilts were stitched, but so were reputations. And if a certain neighbor's preserved cabbage had more bite than last year's, you can bet someone would be remarking on that long after February thawed into memory. And then there were the makeshift winter amusements invented almost entirely out of frost-induced boredom. Children, resisting the relentless need to behave indoors, discovered sledding in much the same way Newton discovered gravity, by simply falling and refusing to stop. Some adults, it's whispered, may have taken turns sliding down icy hills as well. It wasn't exactly dignified for grown settlers to squeal into a snowbank, but dignity, like firewood, tends to run low by January. Mail, if it arrived at all, came courtesy of frostbitten riders on snow-covered trails with the dauntless courage of someone truly unaware of how many wolves lived in those woods. News from the outside world had a strange way of uniting the secluded. Even the most bitter enemies in a settlement would pause hostilities long enough to discuss a flyer from Boston, perhaps a new tax, or an update on someone starting a paper mill. You know, news you could really warm your hands around. Some settlers spoke of winter as a test, as if nature herself wanted to tally who passed and who paused halfway to the woodshed and reconsidered all their life choices. But others, peculiar, cheerful souls, spoke of it as a hush, a gentle stillness that blanketed even the hardest life with a touch of peace. After all, when the wind howled against the shutters and snow piled up beyond escape, it was the perfect excuse to do the one thing no farmer ever truly allowed himself: rest, dream, and wait for the world to soften once more. And as the snow deepened and the fire crackled low, another sound began to fill the quiet corners of the winter cabin, one that hinted, ever so softly, that companionship might just be the most enduring fuel of all. It was in the shimmering stillness of January that the hearth became a portal, not merely to warmth, but to survival, gossip, and the occasional poorly reenacted Shakespeare play. Winters in frontier settlements were not the stuff of snow globe sentiment. It was more like being politely bludgeoned by nature for 5 months. Snow piled against cabin doors like an overeager dog, and wind howled so persistently it felt like the very landscape was trying to pitch its own folk album. When winter truly settled in, travel was out of the question. Roads vanished under white deserts of snow, rivers locked their icy jaws, and the idea of visiting neighbors 2 miles away was akin to setting off on a Nordic expedition with only a pair of mittens and a prayer. Communication with the wider world drifted to a halt, which meant no news, no mail, and no hilarious new political cartoons from back east. The settlers became small galaxies unto themselves, spinning alone in silence. So naturally, people made their own entertainment. And by entertainment, I mean an odd buffet of stories, songs, impromptu plays, spoon duets, and, occasionally comparing everyone's frostbite. Children reenacted summer scenes indoors with such dedication, you'd think they were up for an award, pretending to fish using a bent spoon and a ball of yarn. Grandmothers told tales so slowly and with so many tangents that by the time they delivered the ending, you'd forgotten the beginning, and occasionally your own name. Foods reflected the season's isolation just as much as the people did. Winter pantries were mystical realms of root vegetables and wishful thinking. Cellars contained potatoes that blinked when you opened the hatch and beets so old they were considering retirement. But most importantly, there was the bread. Simple, brown, and sometimes uncomfortably brick-like, bread recipes became precious heirlooms. The sturdy loaves were made slowly, often with sourdough starters kept alive like strange and smelly pets. And there were beans, endless beans. Settlers had a near spiritual relationship with them, and not always in a good way. They were dependable, like an old barn cat, but after the third week of bean-centric meals, they lost a bit of charm. Still, people got creative. They made bean pies, bean mash, bean stews, and what one man in Vermont boldly called bean flambé, which involved a little fire, a lot of imagination, and a slightly scorched beard. But amid the tedium, winter also had its magic. Frost-laced windows became works of accidental art, and the snow, though blinding at times, cloaked even the shabbiest outhouse in elegance, night. As the fire crackled and the wind pressed gentle threats against the door, it wasn't uncommon for settlers to sit together quietly, the silence stretching long and warm. People didn't need to talk much after a while. They'd run out of news by the second week of December and were now simply marinating in togetherness. Local folklore grew thicker in winter. Trapped indoors with nothing but time and dwindling lamp oil, settlers spun ever more elaborate tales. Some were warnings, like the story of the petticoat ghost who stole biscuits left unattended on the hearth. Others were nonsensical, such as old Elias and the time he claimed to have seen 2 squirrels fencing in the maple grove. No one believed him, but everyone wanted to. Winter even inspired a kind of fashion. Not elegant, mind you, but remarkably layered. A settler might begin with woolen long underwear, followed by 3 undershirts, 2 vests, a deer-hide jacket, and a shawl crocheted by a relative who believed in volume over artistry. Hats were less about style and more about physics, sometimes so large they made it difficult to get through doorways without ducking. But vanity bowed to frostbite every time. With each passing week, the snow pressed in a little tighter, the cold dug a little deeper. And yet something curious happened. The settlers, cut off, snowbound, bored, began to soften. Old feuds melted like chimney snow. Folks who hadn't spoken since the firewood dispute of '83 now shared parsnip soup and dried apple rings. Kindness, it turned out, was excellent insulation. And so the towns, though isolated from the world, began to form their own rhythm, quiet, creaky, and weirdly musical. As February's pale edge approached and the days blinked open a bit earlier, a quiet shift stirred in the communal air. But before the thaw teased its first promise, a certain midwinter ritual awaited, one involving shadows, superstition, and a rodent with a surprising amount of political influence. Just before the thaw, in those stubborn final weeks of deep winter, the settlers often turned to that peculiar tradition of the visiting crack-up. That's not a medical term. Crack-up referred to what happened to folks if they didn't see someone outside their own household for too long, and visiting was exactly what it sounds like. Bundling up in furs, braving blizzards, and sledding 30 wailing miles to a neighbor's log cabin where biscuits and conversation, sometimes in that order, sometimes not, awaited. It required a special kind of desperation to consider travel by sleigh in weather so cold your own beard might freeze to your buttons. But by February, the isolation started to wrap itself around even the sturdiest souls, like an itchy woolen sock that's been left out on the porch since November. People missed each other. They missed gossip. They missed different wallpaper. And so, in New England and the Northern Territories, there arose, almost organically, a kind of social tradition: winter visitations. Small families with wide, glassy eyes would pile into sleds with jugs of molasses and pie offerings, dishes wrapped in flannel, and set out across the snowfields like cold-weather missionaries of small talk. These expeditions were not without their surprising protocols. Guests, upon arrival, weren't simply welcomed as visitors. No, they were seized with joy, as rare as coffee in February, and promptly told to stay for 3 days. Less would be rude, more would be suspicious, and no one travelled for one night. Not unless they'd taken a horse, and even then, only if they were very dainty about it. Horses, you see, became half-hibernating beasts during these months, stubborn and dramatic. Stabling them securely was an entire ritual on its own. Wrapping their hooves in burlap, feeding them warm bran mash, and whispering apologies when they looked betrayed by the icy wind. Some horses, like General, Buttons, or Lady Whip, and yes, those were real names, became local legends for their flair for the dramatic when confronted with sudden gusts or suspicious puddles of melted snow. The social calls themselves were hilariously formal in their informality. Guests might arrive with grim announcements like, "It's been 24 dinners since I last saw shoulders that weren't mine." And hosts would nod solemnly, ushering them into the warmest corner of the parlour and offering pickled beets alongside tall tales, most of which grew with each retelling during the dragging months of January. Card games, particularly whist and euchre, were favoured. But when supplies ran low, settlers invented house games like "Guess what I put in this stew?" or "Is it cabbage or sadness?" The latter was particularly difficult to win. It's around this time, the third cup of fiddle cider, or the fourth telling of Uncle Eli's pig-chasing accident, that a strange form of affection emerged. People bonded over shared shortages and frozen pant legs. They laughed at the absurdity of their own perseverance. "Remember when we ran out of oil and used thawed bacon grease for the lantern?" someone would say. And everyone would nod, warm with nostalgia and barely aware of the lingering smell. Evenings stretched into half-nights, with no clocks loud enough to interrupt them. The world peeled away as snow hissed gently against shuttered windows. The fireplace would speak in its wooden language, popping and cracking like it was telling secrets too slow for words. These frozen visitations weren't just survival tactics. They were rituals of rehumaning. If winter pulled people inward, these gatherings were the long, awkward, sled-bound reach back toward community. Neighbors remembered that even if the world was white and still, laughter had a way of defrosting a soul. Eventually, bedrolls were unfurled, and guests were nestled onto straw mattresses or, in cozier households, tucked into the grandmother's bed while she was unceremoniously relocated to the parlour. Again, no one complained, especially not Grandma. She got to sleep closer to the stove, and so the night drifted on, soft as the snow outside, with dreams of spring whispered across quilts, and the promise, tacit yet well understood, that the next visit would be at someone else's log cabin, provided they could dig a trail through the drifts. Far beyond the laughter and lanterns, the wind played delicately in the eaves, nudging at something hidden not far off. A subtle change in the light, a scent on the air. The earliest, tiniest rumour that winter's grip might be thinking of loosening. As the winter shadows grew longer and the trees stood like silent sentinels wrapped in frost, the settler cabin became a world unto itself. 4 walls of wood and whimsy containing an entire society of grumbling stomachs, creaking joints, and elaborate tales told for the 4th or 5th time. You see, by late January, the challenges of wilderness living no longer had the fresh excitement of adventure. They instead took on the weary familiarity of that one pair of warm socks you swore you washed, but whose scent suggests otherwise. The snow had reached that majestic height where it could hide a fence, 2 goats, and possibly a short cousin. Roads were long forgotten memories, blurred by snowdrifts and dreams of spring. Travel was no longer just difficult. It was considered an extreme sport requiring woolen bravery and skis made from fence posts. So, what does one do when winter cuts you off from the world? Aside from wearing all your clothes at once and trying to decide whether eating the emergency candle would be a crime against survival or interior decoration, you invent things. Some settlers crafted entirely new tools out of absolute boredom and leftover barn parts. Take Mr. Alonzo Hempel, who in 1789 invented the automatic butter turner, a contraption operated by a crank, a skittish goat, and an ambitious use of pulleys. You simply tied the goat to the crank, startled it with a pan lid, and hoped your butter arrived before the shed caught on fire. Others turned to the fine art of wintertime cuisine, a genre less about flavour and more about existence. Frozen dumpling stew, bark tea, and something ominously named apple shadow pudding were all staples. Apple shadow pudding, for context, is what you make when you're out of apples and hope is your last ingredient. Still, even in these frozen months of scarcity, settlers became masters of substitution. Out of sugar, use molasses. Out of molasses, use boiled down beets. Out of beets, well, good luck. You're just decorating snow at that point. One of the strangest yet most reliable rituals of this wintry isolation was the calendar shout. In the depth of February, when the mind had gone soft and the silence was too loud, certain families would step outside at sunrise, hold up the almanac, and loudly declare what day it was meant to be. This wasn't to keep track per se. It was more of a ceremonial nudge to the universe that yes, they were still here, and yes, they still demanded Tuesdays. Stories, of course, took on new lives during these long dormant nights. With no visitors and a frozen postal system, snowshoes aren't great for delivering bills. Tales grew tall by necessity. A bear sighting became a bear waltz. Squirrel thievery became an underground rodent mafia. And that single owl who hooted each night was either a weather prophet or the reanimated spirit of Great Aunt Maud, depending on how many cups of birch bark brew you'd had. There's a charming dance to this kind of madness. Cabin fever, far from being the stuff of horror movies, was often a gentle slip into eccentricity. One might start naming the hearthstones, or constructing elaborate soap operas starring icicles. Children created intricate snow villages using old spoons, bits of straw, and heavy doses of imagination, complete with governments, holidays, and snowman citizen councils. The truth is, winter didn't just cut settlers off from the outside world. It nudged them inward, toward the softer, stranger parts of themselves. In those dimly lit rooms heated by embers, people learned to laugh at soup catastrophes and to appreciate a well-told joke. even if it was the same joke you heard yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. Evenings were often capped with quiet fiddle songs, played not out of performance, but simply because silence, while majestic, can grow heavy in the bones. When the melody floated through chinked logs and frosted panes, even the wind seemed to pause and spindle its fury into a slower waltz. Yes, as February stretched on like a cat in a sunbeam, time lost its urgency. The clocks, if ticking at all, seemed unsure. Days folded into one another like well-read letters, ink fading but meaning intact, and when a knock came at the door, whether real or the product of wind nudging a loose shutter, it was met with wide eyes, hopeful hearts, and perhaps a slightly overcooked batch of apple shadow pudding hastily hidden. But even as winter held the world in its crystalline grip, something new stirred in the silence. Something just beneath the snow line, waiting to thaw. In the deepest hush of a New England winter, when even the squirrels had given up on mischief and were curled tightly into nests like furry cinnamon rolls, a curious quiet settled over the outermost settlements. It wasn't just the snow softening every sound or the wind hemming in their timber cabins like a white picket prison. It was the deep, rhythmic quiet of a world paused. Not broken, mind you, just deeply paused, like a fiddle mid-note, bow raised mid-air for spring's return. By January, most settlers had adjusted to their new lives as squirrels, minus the tail, plus an obsessive relationship with root, vegetables. Potatoes were the loyal sidekicks of every cold weather meal, stoic and comforting beneath a predictable layer of salt pork, or, if you were feeling fancy, a spoonful of last summer's pickled cabbage. Turnips were tolerated, onions worshipped, and any family with a pumpkin left intact by January was probably already regarded with a mix of awe and suspicion. Outdoors, nothing moved unless it absolutely had to. That included humans. Leaving your cabin before sunup became one of those reckless acts whispered about by the hearthstones. "He left at dawn," they'd murmur, "to get water." And everyone would glance respectfully at the brave fool defying both frostbite and etiquette. And yet, things did move, just very, very slowly. Letters, for instance, had an admirable sense of perseverance. If you managed to pen one and hand it to the right fur hat, the message might, by sheer hoof, sled, or snowshoe power, arrive at its destination weeks later. Of course, by then the news, "We are out of molasses," was no longer urgent, but rather a charming historical tidbit. If responses came at all, they were equally out of step, like a dance partner arriving after the music ended. But in spite of winter's best attempts to isolate, humans, delightfully stubborn as they are, still found ways to connect. Visiting neighbors became less of a social nicety and more like a polar expedition undertaken for science. You bundled up so thickly that by the time you trudged the half-mile to the Smith's porch, no one could tell if you were Mr. Harbin from next door or a walking stack of quilts that grew legs. Inside those cabins, as hickory snapped in the hearth and snow pressed its nose longingly against the small glass panes, a new form of survival emerged, the art of passing time. In tight quarters, packed with relatives, chores, and just enough furniture to walk into daily, the settlers wove their wintertime hours together with small comforts. Mending, clothes by lamplight felt like a secret covenant with the future. May specifically, when the roads would muddy and life would resume at more than 0 miles per hour. Books were passed from neighbor to neighbor until their pages softened with reading and humidity, faintly smelling of wood smoke and potatoes. Many rarely saw more than 3 in a season. But those few tomes were read and reread until their characters became honorary members of the household, complete with speculative marriages and imagined opinions on the turnip situation. Then there was storytelling, oral, improvised and sprawling. Tales grew taller than the snowdrifts, and children learned to sort truth from fiction by the twinkle in their uncle's eyes, and whether or not the story included a talking bear named Margaret. Spinning wheels and knitting needles clicked gently in tandem, with voices sharing tales. It was equal parts productivity and pretend. You made socks while telling your cousin about the time your grandfather wrestled a raccoon for a wedge of cheese. The raccoon always won, of course. The moral remained elusive. Even music survived in this far-flung stillness. Fiddles returned from summer hibernation, soared through with cheer and frost-nipped fingers, while spoons clanked spiritedly against knee or mug. A snowy gale might howl outside, but inside rhythms formed their own kind of resistance, the kind that insists, firmly but politely, that joy will remain at the dinner table. And so, though cut off in all practical senses, no footsteps on the road, no letters on the horizon, no shipments but the occasional miracle sled, the settlers still buzzed quietly beneath the surface, a winter hive of hopes and salt pork. As February tiptoed into view, icicles grew their own personalities, and people's breath puffed stories into the cold air like temporary smoke signals to the universe. Next comes the quiet rebellion of late winter, the season of schemes, hope-churned butter, and mysterious daylight. In the heart of winter, when the snow pressed against the wooden walls of the cabin, like a polite but firm invitation to never leave, the settlers began to play a strange and silent game. It was called, "Who Can Pretend the Chill Isn't Part of Their Soul." The rules were simple. Sweep the corners, stir the porridge, and say nothing as the frost crept in through every possible crack like an uninvited cousin who intended to stay the season. At this point in winter's tyranny, time began to blur, truly blur. Days were divided only by the amount of candle left to burn. There was breakfast porridge, noon porridge, and if you were feeling extravagant, a fashionably late supper porridge. Sometimes, a daring settler might glance out a tiny pane riddled with ice and swear the sun had blinked at them for a moment. The kind of blink that said, "Best of luck surviving. I won't be back anytime soon." Little things took on massive importance. A slightly different turnip, for instance, became newsworthy. "Did you see the size of that one? Down by the root cellar?" Someone whispered, like it was a scandal. And in truth, it was. The scandal of excitement in a season carefully designed to squelch it. Children born during these long weeks indoors had names like Patience, Temperance, and sometimes Nemesis, depending on the labor. Soap operas hadn't been invented yet, so settlers invented their own entertainment. Heated debates over whether one should store potatoes eyes up or eyes down. These frenzied discussions could go on for hours and, if you weren't careful, cause someone to dramatically go churn butter just to cool off. Letters from the outside world. No such creature. Mail had vanished like a warm breeze. News was last summer's gossip repeated with slightly more flair. Did you hear that Martha Jenkins's cow escaped and came back? The entire village's sense of adventure hinges on that tale now. But something peculiar happened during these long indoor retreats. People began to notice one another in new ways. Not always better ways. There were plenty of arguments over who kept moving the fire poker, but in deeper ways. One might observe that old Mr. Flannery had a delightful way of curling his mustache when he pretended to read, even though the book was upside down, or that Aunt Margie's sixth recitation of the family bread recipe, performed dramatically over a smouldering hearth, was a thinly veiled attempt at legacy building, possibly positioning herself as the bread matriarch. Children, unable to run riot outdoors, grew wild indoors instead. Games of jump over that sleeping dog became increasingly advanced, culminating in acrobatic feats best forgotten. They also developed a highly advanced theory that if you stared at a snowflake long enough, it would give you life advice. Little Greta insisted one spoke to her, urging her to never trust turnips. The family humoured her, of course. After all, there was very little else to argue about that hadn't already been argued twice. Sex, though never spoken of directly, infused the cabin like spice in a stew. Babies were consistently born about 9 months after the thickest part of winter, and while no one said anything, many went mysteriously red in the cheeks whenever someone brought up close quarters. But it wasn't all frozen tedium and awkward silences. The dark, oddly, had a way of nurturing creativity. With stores of beeswax candles and endless scraps of cloth, someone would start a quilting circle, though it was more of a quilting blob, given the lack of space. Stories were told, passed down, and slightly altered, because why not? There were no fact-checkers here. In the hush between snowstorms, when the wind died down enough to let you sleep soundly without it whistling your misdeeds at the shutters, settlers found a strange kind of peace. Yes, it was a peace steeped in fatigue, rye gruel, and questionable hygiene, but peace nonetheless. A quiet understanding that once the world closed in, so too did the need to be gentle with each other. And so, as another grey morning stirred beneath layers of wool and routine, something shifted. A shadow moved slightly off course across the snow beyond the window. Not the wolf, nor the usual wind-scattered branches. This looked suspiciously like news. But what kind of news dares travel in winter's final stretch? Well, we'll find that out soon enough. In the curious silence of deep winter, time slowed to a kind of yawn. The calendar on the wall kept up its usual pretense of progress, but in truth, the snowdrifts didn't care what day it was, and neither did the cabin folk surviving them. Somewhere between Christmas and the hopeful murmurs of a thaw, a strange season took hold. Some settlers simply called it the long inside. It sounds ominous, and depending on how many children you had cooped up in one room, it might well have been. This was the era before screen time, and far before Pinterest parents. Entertainment options were few, but settlers got creative in that dreamy, half-frozen way people tend to when talking to the furniture starts to feel normal. Take, for instance, the grand tradition of string storytelling. It involved a loop of nice, pliable twine and a lot of finger dexterity. And sometimes, let's be honest, a level of desperation. Patterns like Jacob's ladder or the prairie dog's eyebrows passed the time like miniature operas of yarn. Children would sit cross-legged on bearskin rugs forming shapes between their fingers, trying to convince younger siblings that this loop meant a buffalo charge and that one signified Uncle Pete falling into his own well again. Adults were not immune to the enchantments of such idleness. They too found themselves fashioning tales to fill the stillness. One farmer in the Wisconsin Territory was said to have spent January persuading his children that the shadow of a lamp on the wall told the story of a noble moose king, complete with political intrigue. The tellers of tall tales may have starred in your favorite frontier legends, but many of those narratives were born from a long winter afternoon, a whittling knife, and a personal war against mind-numbing sameness. In the quiet weeks after the turn of the year, many families hosted their own version of the Indoor Olympics. Broadly defined, these events included feats such as balancing a spoon on your nose for a record 15 seconds, snow boot tossing across the hearth, strictly prohibited after someone took out the stew pot in 1837, and the precarious game of don't breathe on the icicles inside the rafters. Spoiler alert, they always breathed on the icicles. Of course, not all winter amusements were so benign. There were pepper and vinegar cough syrups to be brewed, a spirited process cloaked in mystery and involuntary eye-watering. Recipes varied so wildly that in some homes the final product doubled as both medicine and furniture polish. You know it was working if Grandpa coughed once, and then didn't speak until the spring melt. Either from cure or protest, no one could say. Evening lighting, limited to lanterns and the flicker of firelight, created a warm cave of shadows that made stories feel like they belonged to the timbers themselves. Shadows told fish tales and ghost stories, romances and recipes. Ghosts, by the way, always featured heavily this time of year. Not the terrifying, bone-rattling kind found in city novels. No, these were frontier ghosts. Handy, quiet, and seasonal. One was known for returning every New Year's Eve solely to fix a squeaky hinge and vanish again. In Minnesota, there was said to be a ghost that knitted unmatched mittens until you acknowledged your regrets out loud. And what about the weather itself? By late January, the snowbanks had become so high and reliable they worked as temporary storage space. Some families literally buried supplies in them: cheese, pies, even a bottle or two of dubious turnip wine, making the backyard resemble a grocer's with very misleading signage. One child in Nova Scotia allegedly spent an entire afternoon digging out what he believed to be a forgotten apple pie, only to discover it was a frozen squirrel's personal nut vault. The squirrel was not pleased. Negotiations ensued. So within this snowbound stillness, the settlers' world grew inward and whimsical, like winter had pressed its own kind of storybook seal on the land. Huddled around hearths and kerosene dreams, they made myths out of chores and miracles from mended socks. Their world was small in distance, but endlessly wide in imagination. And somewhere in the hush after the second pot of tea, when the wind gently hummed across snow-blanketed hills, another sound slowly stepped in. The soft crunch of boots outside and a knock at the door. The visitor. We'll meet them next. The snow had not stopped for 6 days straight, and by now it had become its own character in the settlers' lives. A quiet tyrant with a soft touch and a very aggressive scheduling policy. No one in the village remembered a time when the world was anything other than white, cold, and oddly muffled, like the sky had forgotten how to speak in anything above a whisper. Inside the log cabins scattered across the woodland settlements, life had shrunk neatly into the diameter of a wood-burning stove. Furniture was subtly repositioned to maximize proximity to heat, and children invented games that could be played without leaving the warmth of a braided rug. These included such thrilling pastimes as Don't Touch the Floor, It's Hypothermia, and Guess What's in the Porridge Today. As you drift closer to the heart of such a snow-strangled winter, you might find a settler family of 7, all arranged in carefully orchestrated layers, humans beneath quilts, small dogs on laps, and a cat who refused to acknowledge this hierarchy, claiming the pinewood mantle as his imperial throne. The patriarch, a man with the quiet kind of optimism that only comes from having survived 5 winters and raised 3 children without combusting from frustration, was attempting to carve a new spoon, not because his family lacked cutlery. There were in fact plenty of spoons, but carving was how he reclaimed a sense of control in a world where icicles could sprain your shoulder and snowdrifts had opinions. His wife, wrapped in a shawl so thick you could lose a toddler in it, was making what she optimistically called winter stew, a term as vague and polite as a diplomatic letter. The ingredients? Root vegetables, some suspicious grey meat from last autumn, and whatever herbs hadn't yet frozen into little green fossils on the pantry shelf. Outside, time snoozed beneath its blanket of snow. Roads were impassable, rivers iced over. Even rumour seemed to travel more slowly, like stories trudging knee-deep through frost just to get from one cabin to another. The settlers called this the still time, though some wryly referred to it as conversation season. The long months when you finally realized your husband tells the same 3 stories in rotation, and that your neighbor thought sarcasm was a kind of fungus. There was something endearing about how absurdly self-sufficient the people became. When deliveries of mail stopped, families began writing letters anyway, arranging them into neat piles to be sent when the world resumed spinning. One boy wrote a love letter to the girl 5 cabins down, which included a poetic line about icicles reflecting her beauty. Unfortunately, the ink froze halfway through the metaphor, yet it wasn't all isolation and icy soup. Winter, in its peculiar way, curled the community in on itself like a cat in a patch of sun. People shared stories that didn't require accuracy, only rhythm. Grandparents recounted tales from the Great Blizzard of 1927, a storm so fierce it apparently turned a cow into a snow sculpture, though that may have been a statue to start with. Children believed every word, or pretended to, which is almost the same thing. And who could forget the Great Mitten scandal? One enterprising woman, Mrs. Marjorie Albee, had learned to knit with alarming speed during snowbound boredom. By January, half the settlement was wearing mittens she had crafted. By February, it was discovered she had unraveled her husband's old hunting sweaters to make them. He only noticed when he went to retrieve one, and found a pair of suspiciously symmetrical oven mitts instead. The public found it hilarious. The husband did not. Of course, the real magic of such a winter, beneath the cracked jokes and smoky corners of chilled cabins, was the quiet resilience that began to look a lot like love. Families figured out how to live in each other's silences. Songs were invented just to pass the time, then sung again because something about them fit the season. And even the snow, relentless as it was, became less a prison and more a peculiar kind of insulation from the noise, the bustle, the ache of the wider world. At night, their windows glowed like little stars fallen gently into tall drifts. The wind would tap at the panes, asking politely to come in, but no one ever answered. They were inside together, practicing the slow science of waiting. And just behind the heavy cloak of winter sky, something started to stir. A thaw, perhaps, or a story warming its way to the surface. Out here, on the edge of winter's patience, the settlers had begun to develop entire culinary traditions around monotony. Not out of choice, of course, but because by this point, even the most spirited homestead pantry had been reduced to 3 onions, a suspicious jar of something pickled, and a blizzard's worth of flour. There was always flour. The flour, you see, was as much a character on the winter frontier as any weather-beaten farmer or frostbitten cow. It showed up everywhere. Bread, biscuits, dumplings, gravy thick enough to stop a pocket watch. All of it sailing along on the same endless sea of wheat dust. And you might imagine that the smell of fresh bread would be comforting during those long, bleak months. And yes, it was. For the first, say, 43 nights. But by week 10 of the Great Glacial Lock-in, even the scent of half-baked sourdough grew suspiciously similar to the smell of regret. Time, like the treacle used to sweeten their porridge, slowed to a gelatinous crawl. Days were marked not by sunrises, they generally slept right through those, but instead by noises. The creak of ice expanding around the well cap, the sudden collapse of roof snow into the yard, the occasional crunch of tired shoes over packed frost as the neighbor trudged by, possibly just to make sure they hadn't frozen upright in their rocking chair. Conversation took on new forms. With the radio still a dream and books few and treasured, the settlers became masters of repeating themselves with ever so slight variations, just to keep things from getting too spicy. Take Mr. Aldridge from the North Cabin. He perfected an extended tale about the time he met a bear, or possibly it was a hairy man with indigestion. Each telling shifted the details, just enough to keep listeners doubtful and intrigued. Was it wearing a hat? Someone might ask. Oh, I didn't say that last time, he'd reply, squinting into the fire as though consulting a mystical scroll. Must have been thinking of the tax collector. Indoor eccentricities began to coalesce into full-scale hobbies. One enterprising settler named Lorette took up the entirely self-invented art of snowdrift sculpture classification. She assigned names, personalities, and backstories to each drift visible from her window. Drift number 6 was a retired opera singer named Eugenia, who'd once sung for the governor of Ohio. Drift number 9 was a vaguely suspicious accountant. Meanwhile, in the estimation of a few especially anxious husbands, the root cellar had become a bit too inviting a place for their wives' alone time. After all, a cold, dark room filled with quiet and long-fermented cabbages was starting to look more and more like a seasonal spa retreat. Children, cocooned in too many wool layers to effectively rebel, entertained themselves by sliding across the frozen pond on chunks of salvaged barn roof, or crafting snow persons with alarmingly expressive features. One clever lad fashioned an entire snow family and claimed they were only taking over chores until April. As for pets, their winter psychology deserves a whole discipline of study. Cats grew lazier if possible, nesting directly on the stove lid, with the smugness of emperors. Dogs, once proud defenders of the yard, had been reduced to staring wistfully at unshoveled paths, dreaming of rabbit chases and grass. Then there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Written in looping, laboured script on whatever paper was handy, old newspapers, feed sacks, or bark if necessary. These missives contained thrilling updates like Willa tripped on a rug, or February's longer than we remembered. They were folded into kerosene-touched envelopes, waiting for the thaw and the boot-leather postal relay that might deliver them to the next settlement, 3 weeks and 40 sled dogs away. Yet through it all, something quiet and profound nestled deep into the seams of these snow-swaddled lives. Winter had stripped life to its unvarnished essence, not necessarily beautiful, but oddly cozy. Laughs came easier in the flicker of firelight. Loves were whispered, sighed, muttered, chuckled, and by March, the sight of a bird that wasn't mostly frozen became reason enough for a feast. But we are not quite there yet. The snow still clings to the eaves. The wind has not finished its gossip. And somewhere, far below the frozen creek and chimney wisps streaming skyward, the earth is readying the faintest stirring of spring. Let's lean in closer now, for the hush that comes just before change. As the long breath of winter finally exhaled over the snow-slumbered world, the settlers, wrapped in layers of wool and yesterday's hope, began to hear something strange drifting through the white silence outside their cabins. It wasn't howling wolves, nor the groan of ice shifting into place like an old man settling into a chair. No, it was birdsong, the very idea, delicate, almost impolite in such quiet, like a sneeze in a cathedral. Spring had begun to flirt with the idea of arriving, but before the thaw came fully, the winter was determined to give one last dramatic goodbye. A closing act, curtain and all. One final blizzard. Not a polite snow dusting, mind you, but the kind of weather that made even the chimney smoke tuck its tail between its wisps and turn back inside. Still, something had changed in the settlers. After months of fighting with snowdrifts taller than their memories, of surviving on a diet made mostly out of regret and potatoes, both boiled and innovative, they no longer faced the cold with fear, but with light stubbornness and dark humor. You see, nothing breeds inventiveness quite like desperation. Take the case of Josiah Winthrop, whose cabin was so thoroughly buried that his front door opened directly into a snowbank. Rather than excavate, Josiah simply fashioned a metal stovepipe into a kind of vertical sled shaft and cheerfully climbed out through the chimney each morning like some reverse Santa Claus. His neighbors, the Clemens family, made good use of their cabin's icy entombment by turning one of their windows into a convenient frozen pantry. Hang your smoked ham just inside the window frame, shut it tight, and voila, a naturally refrigerated raccoon-safe meat locker. Of course, the isolation did strange things to people. Reverend Bixby, who initially saw the winter as a divine punishment for the colony's lack of punctuality, underwent a personal thaw and emerged in February declaring that perhaps solitude wasn't a curse, but a Sabbath for the soul. He then took to composing odes to snowflakes and sharing them unasked with anyone who came within range, which, due to the snow, was mercifully few. Over at Widow Greeley's homestead, the children, all 9 of them, had created a rather serious board game carved into the ice floor of their cabin, involving bark chips, thimble pieces, and disturbingly detailed rules about imaginary land disputes. They called it Settlers of Not Quite Catan, and insisted on playing it with strict enforcement of taxation protocols. The days crept longer, their bones stretching with sunlight. Icicles thinned, water dripped in shy applause from rooftops, and cabin fever gave way to cabin gossip. News travelled slow and mostly sideways, passed from chimney to chimney like a smoky old telegram. Old man Rowley's sled dog ran off with his best boot. Martha down the hollow baked a pie using only dried apples and pure willpower. The sun stayed up till nearly 6 last night. Scandalous. Around the fires, stories became less about survival and more about imagination. Remember that storm in January? Someone would say, when the snow came in sideways and Ralph tried to ski uphill. Laughter, warm and ridiculous, would follow. The great irony, of course, was that once the thaw came, folks would miss the quiet, the way sound was muffled by snow-laden stillness, the way the stars looked somehow closer through cold air, the coziness of sharing a single room, a single blanket, a single hope. For all that winter cut them off from the world, it also drew them closer to themselves. It revealed who could tell the best ghost story, who snored like a drunken moose, and who could make stew out of practically anything and still have it taste like a hug. As the last of the snow gave way to mud, glorious mud, signaling both the end of one struggle and the beginning of a soggy new one. The settlers stepped outside their cabins like bears blinking at the concept of sunlight. Life would resume. Letters would arrive from places that had seemed like myth. Trees would bud. The roads would turn from frozen ruts to honest-to-goodness puddles. But inside them, guarded quietly and without ceremony, would remain the knowledge of a season endured, of a long, impossible winter that bowed at last and melted into memory. And so, as the wind softened into something almost like a lullaby, and the last candle flickered low in the window, the settlers, and perhaps you too, felt the weight of sleep settle gently, like a feather on fresh snow.